It always happens where when I'm laying on my bed, the corners just pull off gradually from me laying on it, and then I have to go up and pull them back up again. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about all this beautiful stuff I have, all these awesome worlds contained in these various optical discs, because optical media good, at least uh, it was very prominent at one point. Now, unfortunately, it seems to be dying out. In order to preserve it, I have to resort to measures like buying games from the Philippines. But there will come a day when even they have fast and widespread enough internet to no longer necessitate the continued production of these games. And on that day, I will be a very sad man because, much like the Lewis Wayne paintings that I continue to hang up and try to keep alive in the hearts and minds of people with my small, humble presence on the internet, uh, I'd like to do the same thing for the physical releases of games that we get with my small amount of financial support. Um, there are games that only really have a digital release, at least for certain versions, but often, for the entire game itself. And supporting the physical release not only gives you continued access to said game in um, in the wake of the servers going down, but it also helps you support the companies that are actually choosing to continue producing said product. Of course, it's only one small part. There comes a time when the servers do go down. If you look at a game like Metal Gear Solid, for example, I mean, this had one of the best, most unique online experiences of any game on the internet, or of all time, really. The Metal Gear Solid 3's online, especially with subsistence, groundbreaking, breathtaking, really. And it is not supported in an official capacity anymore. You have to go to private servers in order to play the game. And you can, but there's not going to be that many people out there. It seems like most of the people who are still playing these old games on the internet with me are from Brazil. And that's just because the tariffs are so high in Brazil that it's virtually impossible to buy consumer electronics that were not literally produced in Brazil, which has this effect where there's not like a high availability of many of these products, and instead, the old stuff ends up getting sold over and over again, or they sneak things into the country, or people just buy the new stuff at absurdly high prices, absurdly inflated prices. Um, so you have this situation where a lot of people in that country genuinely just have like a PS2 or a Wii, or if they're really lucky, like a PS3, and that is what they play on. Also, because of poverty, leaving out the tariff component of that. And so I go online and I play these games, and there's a couple people online, but the ping ends up being terrible because they're literally all the way in South America. And it's cool that there's still sometimes some people to play with, but it just feels like I'm grasping onto a dying thing, a dying community, all because I want to experience these works of art that stand the test of time. I mean, This game stands the test of time. I think it's in many ways a Halo killer. Um, there are games that had online back then that are still worth playing today. I don't know where my copy of Battlefield is, but that's the only game where I can like pretty consistently get players. Um, no, in most of these games, it's just dead. I don't think this game has online, but it's a really good game nonetheless. Front Mission 4. That's a classic, if I don't say so myself. If I do say so myself, excuse me. Um, but no, I mean, I think it's something that I'm kind of grasping onto. Speaking of Brazil, you guys ever hear of the Hour of the Star by Clarice Inspector? Very, very good Portuguese novel. My Portuguese is not very good, so I have read the English translation. Um, Not recently. I was going through this book um, again for the first time in literally like 4 years. I really liked the book 4 years ago. I'm checking it out again. It's still really good. Very meta, very I don't know how you say it, coy with how they describe things and situations. You can tell that a lot of overthinking was done in order to kind of simulate the process of uh, the mindset of what it's like to be a writer. Um, you got my high eight tapes here. We love high eight in this house. I love to record things with high eight. Um, but no, I feel as though I am a relic of sorts. Like I'm, a product of a bygone era, one in which people cared a lot about these things. I got my Dreamcast right here. This was the first really major online console, certainly the first to make it a big component of its marketing strategy. I mean, you had consoles like the Saturn, which could do online, but it was not a focal point. It was not a selling point. Dreamcast, on the other hand, they heavily pushed it, and in so doing, revolutionized the industry. It was Windows CE compatible. There's an internet browser you can still use with this thing, and it works. Um, and I look at my television sets. These television sets that at one point illuminated my living room with that bright light that you can only really see on one of these things. It's that specific kind of antique home-like feeling, that feeling of home. I keep all these around. I keep all of these around because I feel as though if I were to let one of these things die out, I would be letting a part of myself, a part of my past die out. And that's sort of the difficult thing to explain about all this because it, you know, I'm a pretty young guy, but all the stuff I grew up with was so old. Like I grew up with all this old stuff. Like I did not have proper internet growing up. I had HughesNet really late into my childhood, but for most of my childhood, I just had dial-up, and dial-up didn't allow you to do very much. You had to hear that fucking sound of the modem go, and the phone would be held up if you wanted to do anything. Nobody could make the phone calls. And you could go on the internet, but just to read text for the most part. And I was on GameFAQs reading about all the games I wanted to buy, the new stuff coming out, the old stuff I was interested in. I wanted to know as much about it as possible. And it's funny, now I look back and I feel nostalgic for the generation of games that I mostly grew up in. That being the one that brought you this bad boy. Um, but at the time, I was dissatisfied with a lot of the trends and the motifs of gaming. I did not like a lot of what was going on the 360 and PS3 with the realistic shooters and everything. So I went backward. I went to the NES, I went to the Genesis, the Saturn, Dreamcast, um, PS2, everything. But my first consoles, were the Dreamcast and the Game Boy Color. That was what I got started on. And then out in the living room, there was the PS2, original Xbox, and the GameCube. And that was my introduction to video games. And it wasn't until very long that, we got a Nintendo 64, that we got a Genesis, that we got an NES. And I found out more of what video game history looked like. So some of my formative nostalgic memories with video games are literally, collecting what would have been considered antiques at the time, um, and developing a sense of what gaming was through that. And even, when I was in school and making friends and stuff, I had friends because of the demographics of the area that I lived in and the kind of people that were there. Those people ended up having the older consoles, and that was all they had. Generally, people had, a 360. In some cases, you had someone with a PS3, but a lot of the people who went to that school did not have either. They had a PS2, or in one very rare case, I knew someone that had an original Xbox. Most people, they just were still on the PS2, and they didn't have high-speed internet. You know, they had to go to McDonald's. I remember that was the big one to connect to the internet. They had to go to the library to connect to the internet. So I was living in this strange time where a lot of people, who went to my school did not even have cell phones. Some of them did, a lot of them did, but they weren't the newest models. They weren't the newest things. They weren't, trying to show off. There were some debates about Apple versus Samsung, but a lot of the kids, especially the ones that I hung out with, that I was rolling with, they did not have any cell phone. Like I knew, one or two that had like the flip phone type thing, but they um they couldn't do anything on there besides load a couple MP3s. And that was the other thing too. The kid that I knew that had the original Xbox that I lent Conker's Bad Fur Day to, one of the most edgy games ever. Uh he had an MP3 player, right? That was how he listened to music when we were on the bus. And I lent Conker's Bad Fur Day to him, and I still remember when he came back to school, so excited over the world that I had shown to him, let's just say. And we were talking about all the crazy shit in the game, like referencing specific moments, joking about it. And it felt so cool because it's like I could share this thing that was important to me, that was formative for me as like I as a person was still forming. And it was like this social thing that we could connect over. I would go to other kids' houses and they didn't have new HD TVs. They had, the little CRT televisions that they had their Xbox 360 hooked up to. And we played Grand Theft Auto 5 that way. We played split screen Call of Duty that way. It was just a fun, it was just sort of a fun look into a different world, I think. But it was also the only world that I knew. I was not aware of a world unlike that one. I just, I didn't know, I didn't fully understand the scale of the wealth and the things that were available to the other people out there. Um, I, I, I think I had this understanding that old things were the norm. I knew that there was another world, but it didn't make any sense to me, right? And seeing people's perspectives on YouTube, seeing what they had, it was very odd, right? Because I had this one conception of reality, but I also knew that it was changing. And throughout my childhood, I had this thought, wouldn't it have been nice to go back to a time when I wasn't even around? Because that was when a lot of this stuff that I really like was prominent and relevant, and there were people to talk to about it. I didn't know how much I should have appreciated my one friend that I'd go over to his house and we'd be playing on the Nintendo 64 on a little tiny screen, because it was all he had. He had a Super Nintendo as well, but um, I don't remember us playing any of that. No, we played 007 The World Is Not Enough. The much worse 007 game on the Nintendo 64. And that's what we did. Um, it's things like that. I just find myself searching through my memory and digging these things up. And I can't help but feel nostalgic. I can't help but feel nostalgic for everything in this room. Even things that are relatively recent. It's like I have memories of these things with a certain person, with various people. I associate them with certain times in my life. And, you know, in the process of trying to give this stuff up, I also feel like I am giving a part of myself up. That some part of me identifies with these things and sees moments of my life reflected back at me through them. And that's a strange experience, but it's an experience nonetheless.